So when you study the book of Judges, everybody talks about a cycle that you find in this book. And without a doubt, there is a cycle in there. But I kind of love how we've ended up talking about, or rather not loving how we ended up talking about it. And if you pull up, and you can do this at home, you can do this if you're watching at home, or if you're catching up, you can do it, or you can just watch the screen, because I'm going to get Rob to do this in a moment. But if you pull up Google or Firefox or whatever search engine you choose to use, and type in Judges sin cycle, you don't have to get very far before, well, there you are. Like, it came up even before Rob had finished typing in sin. You know, it's, I kind of love that, you know. And when you look at this, you can go, so if you go to images, you can see all these different things, and like they just continuously do this, and it's always about a sin cycle. And you can see by the pictures and the images that get pulled up that it's a pretty rampant idea. There's just loads of them. Everybody wants to teach this. There's a fair few people who have pointed out this cycle. So you'll find that they're either called the sin cycle of Judges, or the cycle of sin in Judges, or something along those lines. And if you just scan over those, you'll get the general idea that there's this pattern that happens. And the pattern kind of goes like this. It goes, peace in the land. Israel serves the Lord. Followed by Israel then does evil in the eyes of the Lord. That leads to God punishing Israel. And then Israel's enslaved, which of course leads to Israel crying out to God, which leads to God raising up a judge. And this whole book is about judges, or shofetim, as the Hebrew, in a very dodgy pronunciation way, is called. And the judges are going to end up delivering Israel and restoring peace in the land. And then this cycle just continues, because when peace is restored, Israel's going to do evil again. And God's going to punish them, and they're going to cry out, and God's going to raise up another judge, and Israel's going to be delivered. And so there's definitely a cycle in this book. And I don't want to throw too many stones here, because it's obvious that why we call it a sin cycle. It is. It's fairly obvious. Israel does stuff that is wrong. In a big way, to be honest. And I believe, but actually I believe how we perceive what's going on sort of reveals to us some of our ideas and notions about who God is. And I think actually it kind of helps us, it kind of reveals to us a little bit about how we understand the heart of the Father as well. And this is why when we started this study, we started all the way back in Genesis chapter 1. Where God, because that's where God started as well, you know. Not that, or started his story. He was before Genesis 1. Just, you know, to point it out, he is eternal and not created. However, if you're going to look at the book of Judges and this cycle, like, and just take this heading of sin cycle or whatever, you know, if you take the heading out and forget whatever cycle of sin or sin cycle or whatever it is that we've kind of been maybe preemptively taught or suggested, and just look at the cycle itself, and just the pieces of whatever it is that we're looking at, I think there's two ways of looking at it. There's the Genesis 3 way of looking at it, where, you know, man is the problem, or there's the Genesis 1 way of looking at it. Because we believe that creation is good, and we believe that God loves it, and he thinks it's enough, and he thinks that it's worth redeeming, and he thinks that it's worth so much that actually there's something going on there. And in fact, I think we even found it a story of Noah, where God's going to destroy the world, but at the end of the story, he says what? What does he say at the end of Noah? What does the rainbow symbolize? Never do it again. Never do it again. And even if like the whole world kind of goes totally off rails, and like nobody ends up, like we all renounce our faith and just, the crazy stuff happens. God has said, I will never repeat what I did in Noah's day. I'll never do that again. And so my thundering question in my head, as I've always heard this taught time and time and time again, is why is this a sin cycle? When we see the cycle of the people of the book of Judges, how comes our focus is on sin? How comes this isn't focusing on the redemption of God? How comes this cycle isn't about God's patience and God's understanding and unbelievable long suffering and his continual never-ending pursuit of his people? And the Lord has endless patience. Now, if you're like, hold on, I know the rest of my Bible. God has endless patience, absolutely, but he's going to, this endless patience is going to run out because it's, he is going to punish Israel. And even though they've just entered the promised land, he's going to take them off into exile and all this sort of stuff. Remember our discussion over the last couple of weeks about Joshua. Judges may or may not be, by the way, may or may not be an alternative rendering of how Israel went into the promised land. That's one way you can read Judges. If Joshua is the triumphant, victorious history type of thing, this might be a bit more of an accurate reading about what actually happened. But as Israel gets into this land, the land of Canaan, and tries to figure out what it means to follow God without a king, without a political infrastructure, God has endless patience with his people. And one of the things we need to figure out is that God has endless patience with you and me as well. And as we try to figure out what it means to follow him in our time and our day, in our age, as we wrestle with big issues that are thrown around all over the place. I'm in some very interesting conversations at the moment about all sorts of stuff and trying to pull in different threads to help people understand that actually one of the things that we need to do as we discuss big theological issues is hold grace and love and mercy and patience with one another and patience with people who we have difference of opinions with, and not just, cast them into hell because they believe different to us, unless they're not creedal. Even then, I don't think we should be casting them into hell because that's not our call. But I think, we hold way too many positions and go like, this is a red line, and actually the red lines are much different, I think. Anyway, he has endless patience with us. And we need to keep on remembering this. Actually, we're trying to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. That's what Paul tells us. And sometimes I think we think other people should be doing that, and they just need to believe like we do, or I do. So anyway, in Judges, time and time again, God's acceptance, God's patience. I just don't know why when we look at this, we think sin. And, without a doubt, there is a cycle in here. Without a doubt, Judges is really trying to drill a point into our heads and into our hearts. But I want to suggest that we need to not just focus on the failure of Israel and ultimately our own failure, but God's redemption and his redemptive power. So how come I look at this and I just see the cycle of how badly we screw up and stuff. So, and what I don't see in any of the graphics when you Google it is none of these graphics talk about the patience of God. And so let's really try to push into actually what is this teaching us. And so and maybe read Scripture through a different lens, not to be redactors or anything like that. Actually, we're trying to understand it in a different way, in a Genesis 1 lens. I'm going to pick up here at the beginning of Judges. Actually, I'm going to pick up in chapter 2, and I'm going to start reading in verse 10. And it says this, it says, "After that, the whole generation had been gathered to their fathers. Another generation grew up who neither knew the Lord nor what he had done for Israel." See, apparently, these people didn't remember. They kept on forgetting. They did not want, they did not do what we said at the end of Torah, which is somehow they forgot. Can you remember we put up those pictures of the 12 stones that were just random stone, or well, maybe not random, but they were there to tell stories, to make you stop and wonder. And we kind of ask the question, do we set up stuff that makes people stop and wonder and ask questions so that we can tell the stories about God's grace and God's power in our lives? See, nobody was telling the story of the standing stone. Somehow they forgot. So we continue. It says this. It says, "Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsake the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the people around them. They provoked the Lord to anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. In his anger against Israel, the Lord handed them over to the raiders who plundered them. He sold them to their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. Unlike their fathers, they quickly turned from the way in which their fathers had walked, the way of obedience to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge to save them out of the hands of their enemies, as long as a judge lived, for the Lord had compassion on them. As they groaned under those who oppressed and afflicted them, but when the judge died, the people returned to their ways, even more corrupt than those of their fathers, following other gods and serving and worshipping. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways." Right there, in those two paragraphs, Judges, it pretty much describes in prose form exactly what this cycle is in front of us. It takes us through it really quickly, and then what happens over the next X amount of chapters is it gives the stories to unpack this cycle for us. So we've had Andrew read Judges 3. So try to listen again to the dodgy pronunciations. It says this, we've heard it already, but it says, "The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baal and the Asherahs. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel so that he sold them into the hands of Cush Rishathaim, king of Aram Naharaim, to whom the Israelites were subject to 8 years. But when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Phanuel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them. The Spirit of the Lord came on him so that he became Israel's judge and went to war. The Lord gave Cushan Rishathaim, king of Aram, into the hands of Phanuel, who overpowered him. So the land had peace for 40 years, until Phanuel, son of Kenaz, died. Once again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and because they did this evil, the Lord gave Eglon, the king of Moab, power over Israel, getting the Ammonites and Amalekites to join him. Eglon came and attacked Israel, and they took possession of the city of palms. The Israelites were subject to Eglon, king of Moab, for 18 years. Again, the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and he gave them a deliverer, Ehud, a left-handed son, the son of Gera of the Benjamite. The Israelites sent him with tribute to Eglon, king of the Moab. See, there's that same cycle. If you flip over to Judges 4, you'll hear it again. It says this. It says, again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now that Ehud was dead. So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned with Hazor, Caesarea. The commander of his army was based at Harosheth Hagoyim, or something like that. Hagoyim. Because he had 900 chariots fitted with iron and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years, they cried to the Lord for help. Now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lepidoth, was leading Israel at that time. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided. Now we can jump into all sorts of different places, but let's look in chapter 6 really quickly. It says this. It says, again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites, because of the power of Midian was so oppressive. The Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crop, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern people invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza, and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep nor cattle nor donkeys. They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count them and their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian was so impoverished with the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. When the Israelites cried out to the Lord because of Midian, he sent them a prophet who said, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I snatched you from the power of Egypt, from the hand of all your oppressors. I drove them out before you and gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you live. But you have not listened to me. See, we're not critiquing that there is a cycle that exists. There's a cycle there. So please don't misunderstand me. We're not, there is definitely something that is being hooked into for us. And actually, it's word for word, sitting right there in the middle of every single story. And you can go right throughout Judges, and you can kind of circle and go, here's part A, part B, part C, and so on and so forth. I'm just wanting to ask the question, why is it that we always focus on the failure of man and not the persistent love and never-ending pursuit of God? That's what I find stunning, actually, when I read this stuff. When I read this, it's going like, oh my gosh, God is so patient with his people. Why does he keep sending judges and rescuing his people when he knows they're just going to make the same mistakes? That's because of his patience. So we've talked about Othniel, we've talked about Ehud, we've talked about Shamgar, and there are these are not the famous judges. I bet if you was to say who, can name a judge of Israel, you'd probably think of maybe 2, maybe 3. So Deborah, what? Ruth. That's an interesting one. We'll get on to Ruth. Gideon. Yeah, who's a third judge? Very famous. Samson. Absolutely. We'll get there. So you've got Deborah, a big story. Deborah's a big story. And there's lots of good stuff, and maybe some good conversations about women and their place in the world there. The story of Gideon is a really big story. Seems like the book of Judges seems to slow way down and all of a sudden takes time with the story of Gideon, which I find really interesting. Lots and lots of good stuff in the story of Gideon. And we'll come back to that in a moment. And then we've got other stories such as Zeba and Zalmunna that are still in the midst of the Gideon story, which really doesn't end until chapter 9. And then you've got the story of Abimelech, and then Jephthah, and after Tola and Jair, and you've got Jephthah. There's some dodgy names to throw at you. Read the book. Try to pronounce the names yourself. One of my favourite stories, and there's a couple from Judges, but one of my favourite stories is there's a tare, a weed called a shibboleth or shibboleth, depending on where in the ancient world you came from. And the story kind of goes, and it's in the story of Jephthah, and you're going to read about people trying to sneak over to Jordan, into the Jordan. And one of the things that they do to identify who's coming over the Jordan is they get them to say this word, and if they mispronounce it, they get killed. I would be in so much trouble. So basically, they come over. The guards would go, what's this? What am I holding in my hand? And they'd say, shibboleth. And they'd go, wrong. Which kind of, it kind of raises so many questions. But ultimately, Jephthah asked for God's deliverance against his enemies and makes this vow. That God, if you will save me, if you will help me deliver me from the hands of my enemies, I will sacrifice the first thing that comes out of my house to you. And it's, and God does this. He delivers them out of the hands of the thing. And later on in our studies, we're going to talk about binding and loosing and all stuff like that. But this is a really quite horrific story in one sense. But it makes us confront something, because actually what happens is we kind of make this huge judgment on Jephthah. About how hasty he is to make this promise to God. Because what happens is Jephthah assumes something. He makes his promise to sacrifice the first thing that comes out of his house to God. Now, he assumes that that's going to be some sort of animal, because of the way that houses back then were constructed. They were insulars, and either the animals were downstairs or they were at kind of like they were at the front of the house and stuff like that to keep safe and stuff. But so he assumed that actually you pick the animal, God, that you want me to sacrifice. But what happens is his daughter, so excited that dad's coming home, sees him at a distance and runs out the house. And he's left with this confrontation of like, I've told God that I'll sacrifice the first thing that I see coming out of my house, and it's my daughter. Now, in the story, the impression is he goes through with the sacrifice of his daughter, which sounds horrific. He kind of gives her some time to go about and grieve and stuff, but and wail and stuff. And there's lots of questions raised about about this. But what it does is it raises a question to us: what's the weightier command? When life hands you situations where two commandments, two things are conflicting, in this clay. Why am I saying place? In this case, there's a commandment of do not murder, or at the very least love each other, and love your neighbor as yourself, versus don't go back on your oaths you made to God. God won't hold you blameless because you've made an oath. So we kind of have to go, which is the weightier law? What is it? Is it to preserve life, or is it to be obedient? To fulfill a vow? Because actually, I would argue that preserving life is being obedient as well. So I would hope that most of us might say that preserving the life of his daughter is the weightier law. Yeah? Anybody wanting to kill the daughter? Kev? So, see, I like the argument, actually, there's probably room in this story to say that he didn't actually go all the way through with the sacrifice when you read it. It leaves it a bit ambiguous. And if I'm honest, I've not bumped into a whole lot of midrash teaching on this story or oral tradition or anything like that. It doesn't mean that it's not around. It just means I've not encountered it yet. Mainly because I haven't spent a whole load of time wrestling with this, because I do think actually one of the things that it teaches us is that there is a weightier law. There is a way that we get to decide what's right or wrong when we're looking at this. And there's a great bit of teaching called Drop the Jawbone, originally from Rob Bell. I do recommend some of his teaching, not all of it, but some of his teaching. And it's well worth listening to, far better than me on this particular thing. And then, of course, the story of the book of Judges ends with the story of this Levite who's got a concubine, and it's almost like a retelling of Sodom and Gomorrah. And if you're reading the story of Judges, he visits the town in Benjamin, the tribe of Benjamin. They come and they do to the concubine what the people of Sodom and Gomorrah are doing. It's like word for word the same story. And this is how far the people have digressed and devolved. They've become something which they know God hates. And this is how much they've forgotten where they've come from. They've forgotten their story. And so they're actually repeating the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah. And maybe you're sitting there going, well, it sounds to me like a sin cycle. Well, here's the funny thing. At the end of the book of Judges, God doesn't forsake his people. He's not giving up on them. He's not casting down fire from heaven to destroy them. And when we rejoin the story in 1 Samuel, he's still there. He's still being patient. Even when they show up and start asking for a king, God's not killing them all. And this is just so much about his patience and his enduring love and his compassion to his people. Now, if you do end up looking at the book of Judges and you are astute, more astute than me, you may wonder if, in fact, there may or may not be some sort of chiasm taking place. And it's interesting because if you're looking at the book of Judges, I've not gotten this to work out perfectly, but if you're looking there, there is a pattern that leads us to somewhere. And the first half of Judges has Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, which are all short. And then you get Deborah, which is a medium-length story, and then Gideon, which is a big chunk of Judges, multiple chapters of Gideon. And then you've got a little story of Abimelech, a medium-sized story of Abimelech. I've written again, so that would be wrong. Anyway, a medium-sized story of then you've got Jephthah and Tola and Jer, and then Tola and Jer, they actually come before Jephthah, and then all of a sudden you've got Samson, or Shimshan, as his name is in Hebrew. Why we call him Samson when you could say Shimsham, I don't know. I think it's great. Shimsham. Sounds like some sort of product you clean your car with, isn't it? So but anyway, but all of a sudden it's multiple chapters. It's a multiple chapter story again, and I feel like there's some parallelism there. I haven't necessarily made a whole lot out of it yet, but I think there's stuff for us to really drill into and go, what is it? Why do we go short, short, medium, long, short, short, medium, long? There's a parallelism there. One of the things I did notice on a Google image search is a table that actually shows the enemy, the years of bondage that the judges rescue them out of. And there's a guy called Brad Gray in his book. He wrote a book called Make Your Mark. And you can actually see, I think there's something going on in the narrative where there's 8 years of bondage to the Mesopotamians. Then Nathaniel gives them 40 years of rest. Then there's 18 years to Moab, and Ehud gives 80 years, a double portion. Deborah, after 20 years of bondage to the Canaanites, gives them 40 years of rest. After 7 years of bondage to the Midianites, Gideon gives them another 40 years of rest. We've got 40 years of rest, 80 years of rest, 40 years of rest, 40 years of rest, and Jephthah, and we're wrestling with the obedience of Jephthah. So it's maybe something to take note of, because actually after Jephthah, there's only 6 years of rest. See, I don't know, there's something there, but it's interesting. Then, of course, there's Samson. They're in bondage for 40 years in Samson. And that is by far the most they've ever been in bondage. And they're in bondage twice as much as what they're delivered. That's the time that is the most obvious. Samson is the only judge outside of Jephthah where we're told that actually the length of rest isn't corresponding to the length of bondage. So Samson only gives them 20 years of deliverance and rest. And the Midrash says that if Samson doesn't do what he's told, basically doesn't do what he's told, then he doesn't fulfill his place. What we've got to remember is that Samson's supposed to be a Nazarite, and there's all sorts of vows that you take as a Nazarite. And Samson, quite frankly, is the worst Nazarite ever. Really is. And he doesn't do anything that God asks him to do. And it's not until the end of his life, after his eyes have been taken, and he's totally been put into a place and a sense of shame, and robbed of his honor and stuff, that he accomplishes the thing that God wants him to accomplish through his life. And it doesn't seem to actually take because he never wants to live up to the call of God. Can anybody remember what tribe he's from? He's from Dan. There's a few people going, from last, there's a lot, yes, there's a lot. Now, you remember Dan last week with the crossroads of the earth. Dan is meant to be right in the middle next to the big brother Judah. But where do they end up? At the top. Right far up north. And they end up being destroyed, don't they? See, they never had a leader that they were supposed to have in Samson. A lot of these judges, we can critique their methods, and their methods are pretty brutal. Involve spikes through bellies and all sorts of stuff. Very ancient, very barbaric. But they seem to give Israel the full portion of rest that they're meant to have. Like I say, 40 years, 80 years, 40 years, 40 years, so on and so forth. But Samson can't pull it off. They only get 20 years of rest. And by the time the book of Judges is over, in fact, Judges 18 is the chapter that in my Bible anyway, it says this. It says the Danites settle in Laish, which is going to be all the way up north. That's where they settle. So they run away to this place. There is a narrative here. I think it's that I'm asking us to notice. There's a larger narrative in Judges that rather than just a smattering of stories about sin and the consequences of sin. So don't get me wrong, sin is problematic as a British understatement. But this is God trying to teach his people with endless patience, with endless patience, teaching his people how to walk the path well with him. At this point, it's not working, but God's not losing patience. See, if we look at it just like, sin, we're just going to get punished, then we live in fear. Sin has its consequences. We can read that here and we can see that. And yeah, absolutely. I'm not saying we escape consequences for our sins and stuff like that. With stuff that we need to make right and stuff. But God's not going to run out of patience. He's going to keep on drawing us back. See, really, he's not going to run out with patience until they become the anti-story. And God has a story he's trying to tell. And we said that we could wrap up Torah in one word, and that word was partnership. God's found a partner, and he's trying to tell a story. He's got a partner, and with this partner, when this partner becomes the anti-story, it's going to call God to action. God has to do something about that because he's going to put the world back together. That's what he's trying to do. And so it's not that God runs out of patience. It's not that God doesn't love his people anymore. It's not that all of a sudden we found the bottom of the bottomless fries at whatever place you want to go to eat bottomless fries. It's not that, it's not that God stops loving. See, it's when his partner starts working against him. The one thing I suggest is that maybe it feels like he's kicking a dead horse, and so he's trying to bring life back into it. And we need to learn that it's one thing to be trying to follow God and making mistakes. There's nothing wrong with that. We can make mistakes, and God will welcome us back. Go, fail, try. It's one of my heroes of my faith is a guy called John Wimber, and he said, faith is spelled R-I-S-K. An American teacher recently said, actually, maybe people are a little bit risk averse, so let's call it like faith is spelled T-R-Y, because people will try stuff. But when we try things, when we take risks, when we do experiment with stuff and all that sort of thing, we make mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes end with not just us going like, that wasn't the right thing to do. It can sometimes lead us into sin because we get cross or we get angry with each other or whatever happens. But as we're trying to work out what it means to be kingdom people and to see the kingdom come and see God's work in our land, he's going to have endless patience with us. It's when we become the anti-story, when we actually start working against his purposes and against his plan, where we try to, where basically it's all about our self-preservation and our own agenda, that's when things get a little bit tricky and a little bit dicey, again, for British understatements. And certainly that's what we see in Scripture. So when Israel starts to become the anti-story, instead of being the light to the world, becomes totally exclusive. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. See, I just don't want to talk about this cycle that we see in Judges as a sin cycle. And focus on the sin and go like, we're just so terrible. It's awful, isn't it? This is what it is, and it's consequence, and blah, 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 and we must toe the line. Otherwise, we'll have modern day Amalekites coming along. I want to talk more about the fact that God is not running out of patience with his people. That there is this cycle that demonstrates a God who loves his people, loves his world, loves his creation with so much that he is pursuing and crying out for the oppressed and longs to see his people partner with him in that to bring about the redemption of the world. To introduce people to Jesus, to say this is how it comes about. See, God's got. What's interesting is that God is pursuing the cry of the oppressed, because eventually the cry of the oppressed in the book of Judges comes from somewhere. Where does it come from? Does anybody know? We had it in our reading. Who cried out to God? Israel, his people. Do we cry out to God for the oppressed? Do we cry out for to see stuff change? Not just a little bit, but is our heart breaking? See, God's people are crying. They're crying out because of their own failure and their own frustrations and their own mistakes and their own synchronization with pagan culture. And they're at fault, absolutely. But they're crying out and God's rescuing. And what's going to happen later is God's people are going to build an empire. And all of a sudden, it's going to be about the people under Israel's thumb that start to do the crying out. And that's where God says, you've become Pharaoh. You've become Egypt. You're no longer a partner. You're now the anti-story, and we've got to fix that. So let's not discount this redemption cycle and what it's got to teach us. We've got to be a people who are willing to cry out for the oppressed, to recognize that actually there's that we can partner with the oppressed. We can stand for justice. We can stand for righteousness. But we've got to make sure that we're including people, not excluding people. We've got to make sure that we are passionate about the things that God is passionate about. Because ultimately, when we become exclusive and we build empires, we become the anti-story. When we start pushing people away and saying, oh, you can't be in because of X, Y, Z, then I think that's where we end up in danger of pushing the limits of this endless patience. Which sounds like a contradiction, doesn't it? Because how do you push the limits of something that's endless? I don't know. But God has this plan for the redemption of the world. And it's Jesus. And in some senses, that does make it an exclusive thing because it is Jesus. I'm not universalist or anything like that. It's not me what I'm saying in a slight little bit. People need Jesus. We all need Jesus. But he's put you and I in this place to be a people who continuously share this invitation. You go, God's got this redemptive story for you. That he's inviting you in, that he's looking to extend his partnership because he's bringing this world back into its right order. That's why we pray your kingdom come on earth as in heaven. It's the hope of the world.